We have 4 speakers in this morning's session. And we're going to start off with Aidan Keane. Aidan Keane's from the University of Edinburgh. And incidentally did a recent rather interesting synthesis of conceptual frameworks. Ecosystem services, poverty alleviation. I found that useful. You might grab one from him later. Anyway, Aidan, over to you. 15 mins and a 5-minute warning.
20 mins. 20
minutes, sorry. And a 5-minute warning. Thank you.
Many of you will probably know Tanzania, so I won't give any in-depth background, but broadly, Tanzania is to many people famous as a kind of high biodiversity hotspot with iconic wildlife populations, wildebeest sweeping across savannas, but there's also very widespread poverty. It's difficult to put a very precise number on what proportion of the population are dependent on natural resources, but suffice to say it's very high. And one of the potential ways of driving development that has been proposed is to make use of Tanzania's high tourism potential, to harness the potential of ecotourism and wildlife-based tourism to improve the livelihoods of poor rural people. But there are numerous challenges to this. Tanzania has relatively low capacity for resource management. There are challenges to do with poor governance. And there's been, whether rightly or wrongly, there's been a lot of international concern about conservation problems such as high levels of poaching driven by external demand. So conservation policy in Tanzania has followed broadly a kind of similar arc to conservation in other parts of the world in many ways. There's currently 16 national parks, and approximately 40% of the country, again depending on what you include in that number, is under some form of conservation protection. But the creation of parks and protected areas has been associated with the history of land seizure in some areas and forestry settlement, and has generated a lot of resentment in some communities and significant problems for some local communities. So over time, legislation has developed, and in 1998, the Wildlife Policy of Tanzania created a framework whereby local communities were able to participate in the management of natural resources. And this led to the creation of wildlife management areas. And wildlife management areas, in short, are Tanzania's version of community-based natural resource management. I'll talk a little bit about the extent to which they are truly community-based later on in the talk, but that's the idea. And in 2006, 2007, the first pilot wildlife management areas were registered. So what does it actually mean to be a wildlife management area? Well, the process to set it up is slightly involved, it's fair to say. The idea is that villages come together to set aside land for wildlife. In practice, this is often driven by international NGOs who kind of have an interest in particular areas of land, and villages are encouraged to set up these wildlife management areas. Having made that decision, they then go about electing a community organisation which can help to manage the resources and the land. There are various plans which have to be made, and ultimately, having agreed to set aside some of this area for conservation and for other resource uses, the land use plans, the management plans are sent off to the Director of Wildlife for approval, and at that point, user rights can be granted back to the local communities if everything is judged to be appropriate. So in theory, it's a participatory process, but there is heavy involvement from outside in terms of shaping the direction of wildlife management areas. As of today, there are 19 WMAs in operation. These cover just short of 150 villages and about 450,000 people. But it's planned that these will be expanded significantly in the future, and if the 38 that are currently planned do all come into existence, this would cover about 7% of Tanzania's land area. So it's a very significant form of natural resource use and land management in the country. And Tanzania's objectives can broadly be kind of categorized as to increase the participation of local communities in the management of wildlife resources, to enable local communities to derive benefits from wildlife resources, and to enhance the conservation of wildlife resources. So as is often the case in this kind of community-based conservation, community-based resource management, the idea is that they can balance both community needs with conservation needs. And the project that I'm presenting about today, the PIMA project, broadly asks the question of what have been the impacts of Tanzania's wildlife management areas so far. So what are the social and what are the ecological outcomes of WMAs? Because this is quite a complex question to answer, we took an approach which used a wide variety of different methods, everything from more qualitative interviews to try and understand the kind of experiences of change within local communities, to understand the governance arrangements. We have some more ecological measures using remote sensing to try and look at land cover change, and commissioned aerial surveys which are looking at large mammal populations. But the things that I'm going to focus on today are on the social side of our impact evaluation. I'm going to look at data coming out of a large-scale wealth ranking or wealth categorization exercise that we carried out in all of the villages covered by our study, and also some detailed household surveys which were carried out with a subset of households within those villages. And before I launch into what we actually did and what the results are, I just want to talk briefly about why impact evaluation is such a challenge in this context. And it's something which is true for conservation more broadly, not just for wildlife management areas. So in an ideal world, if you come from a natural science background at least, you would argue that the way to understand cause and effect is to carry out an experiment. You want to experimentally manipulate which units receive the treatment and which units are kept aside as controls and measure outcomes in both of those cases. Of course, we can't do that in conservation. We can very rarely do that in conservation. Experiments are very rarely possible. There's a number of reasons why. One of them is that the interventions, the kind of treatment conditions, are often can't really be replicated strictly from one place to another. In the case of wildlife management areas, the precise details are kind of tailored to local situations and local needs. There's often many interventions occurring together. So if we wanted to kind of try and isolate the effect of wildlife management areas, it would be nice to compare those to other areas of Tanzania where nothing else is going on, nothing else is changing. But that's not the case. In a real-world situation, that's never going to be the case. And you always have to account for the fact that there are other conservation interventions, other development interventions going on at the same time in similar areas. And on top of that, there's a number of other problems. There are complex histories. These areas haven't all arrived at having a wildlife management area, by taking the same route. So there's potentially differences in the kind of, the way that villages have come to join wildlife management areas. And a common problem which we, again, you see all over conservation is that these things weren't necessarily designed in a way that makes them easy to evaluate. So there aren't always the baselines that you'd like, the baseline measurements that you'd like before WMA establishment, and there's not the kind of obvious control counterfactual situation that you'd like. As I said, it's kind of confounded by the fact that there are other things going on at the same time. And then just to put the icing on the cake, we're not trying to measure one thing. We're not trying to measure just one single outcome of interest as you would normally do in an experimental setup. We want to measure lots of things. As I said, there's things associated with conservation outcomes, things associated with social outcomes, and each of those in themselves can be quite complex and multidimensional. So there's a lot of debate at the moment about how you'd measure well-being, but that's just one example of a concept which we would like to measure. We'd like to know how it changes in response to these interventions, but it can be difficult to pin down exactly what you do to measure that. So that's my list of excuses for why this is a bit harder than it might appear at first sight. I just want to talk briefly about how we've tried to accommodate for all of this. So the overall quasi-experimental design that we took to try and carry out this impact evaluation is called a BACI, a before-after control impact comparison. Broadly, the way it works is that we have take measurements in WMA areas for the pre-WMA condition. As I said, these don't exist in a kind of coherent, consistent way. So we had to rely on asking people to recall what conditions were like before WMAs were created. And we look at how things have changed from before to now, where we can ask people what the situation is like now. We want to know what the counterfactual is, what would have happened in the absence of WMAs. So we need to do the same process in what we're treating as control areas. And then by comparing the change in both of those areas, we can get a relatively robust quasi-experimental estimate of WMA effect. And this is, as I said, certainly not perfect, but this is currently considered state of the art in terms of impact evaluation, where you aren't able to carry out a strict controlled experiment. In terms of where we covered in the study, we selected 6 WMAs in the north, which are listed in red here, 3 WMAs in the north, 3 in the south, so 6 altogether. there's a kind of interesting cultural and ecological distinctions between the north and the south. So we wanted to be able to capture those differences. And then within each WMA, we selected 8 different villages to take measurements from. 4 of them were inside, so they're villages which had joined the WMA, and 4 were outside, villages which weren't part of the WMA, but we selected using a statistical matching approach. I won't go into the details here because of the time, but the idea is that statistical matching is a way of trying to make sure that you're comparing apples with apples rather than apples with oranges. We know that there are good reasons why WMA villages might not be just a kind of random sample of all of the villages in Tanzania. They're likely to be placed in particular areas for particular reasons. So we wanted to make sure that our match control villages were as similar as possible to WMA villages, apart from the fact that they don't have a WMA. And the first kind of big data collection process that I want to talk about, and this is the results that we've gone furthest with in terms of the analysis at the moment, is the wealth data results. So as I said, one of the things we did was to carry out a large-scale wealth categorization exercise. This is something that I think of as a kind of a very broad but relatively shallow approach to understanding change in these areas. So what we did was in each of the villages within our sample, we went through a process of participatory wealth ranking for every single one of the households in those villages. It was a participatory approach because what we're trying to do is to quantify wealth, but we're very aware that what defines wealth in different areas may be different from one context to another. So we didn't want to assume that you could just measure wealth in terms of, say, wealth or poverty in terms of a dollar value. We wanted it to be locally meaningful measures. So we had focus groups within each community which defined how people were going to be split up, how the households were going to be split up into 4 different wealth categories, whether they were very poor households, average households, or relatively rich households. And it's worth pointing out, I mentioned before that we had to use recall to kind of try and measure past events from the pre-WMA establishment period. And these were anchored by referring people back to significant events that happened at a similar time. So it helped to make sure that people were thinking about the period that we were interested in. In the north, for example, there's a large volcano called Oldonyo Lengai, which erupted around 2007, which is just before WMA establishment, and everyone knew about that. It was big and obvious and quite loud and a lot of smoke. So it was very good for making sure that people were thinking about the right points. I won't bore you too much with the statistical details, but we had this big data set covering about 13,500 people, and we fit a Bayesian hierarchical cumulative logic model. Basically, what the kind of key points in that are that it's an ordinal response, so we're using a model which was appropriate to an ordinal response, and it was hierarchical in the sense that it was the model structure accounted for the structure in the data. So we had households nested within villages within WMAs, and our analysis accounted for that. And it also accounted for the fact that these measures of wealth are somewhat different in each one of the villages. So diving straight into results, I'm afraid this doesn't reproduce particularly well on the screen, but I hope you can see that what we have here is the kind of raw outcome of the wealth ranking data. In each one of these sub-panels, it's ranged from very poor, average, and rich households. And it's a proportion of the responses which fell into each of those categories on the 2 axes for both control and WMA communities. The thing that's a bit difficult to see here is that this graph also shows results from 2007 in light grey. You can just about make it out. And then the results now in 2014 is the kind of solid black bars. So there's perhaps not too much to be said about this slide, apart from the fact that the first thing that we see from our wealth rankings is that broadly it seems like the households within our samples have got richer over time. There are a few reasons why we would have expected that, and we can discuss those in questions if anyone's interested. The other important thing from this is that in each one of these 6 WMAs, it seems like the pattern is slightly different, and it seems like the pattern between controls and WMA villages is also slightly different. When we kind of break that down and model these data, accounting for pre-existing differences in the wealth of households, we see that broadly the control communities were all kind of fairly tightly grouped. And the WMA villages, the outcomes are very different. So it seems like in the north, WMAs have actually on average made people slightly worse off relative to controls, whereas in the south, WMAs tend to be, or there appears to have been a positive effect of WMAs in the south. And we can break that down even further to look at differences in terms of both the wealth of the households and in their particular kind of characteristics, whether they had leadership positions or not. Again, won't spend too long on this, but suffice to say that across all of the wealth categories, the effects of being poorer in the north, and actually these are areas where there are WMA revenues versus not, from tourism versus not. Across all of those wealth categories, people were worse off, while in the south, the WMAs without any significant tourism revenue, it seems like actually it was the poorer people who were doing slightly better from the WMA. The other thing to point out from this slide is just that, interesting, it seems that compared to non-leadership households without leadership positions, people who obtained leadership positions in the WMA did relatively very well. So how can we break that down a bit and try and understand what's going on? Well, one of the things we wanted to ask was just, does this match up with whether people accepted WMAs? And broadly, when we asked people whether they were in favour of WMAs back in 2006, there was general agreement that the majority were in favour. And perhaps counterintuitively, given what I've just said about WMAs seeming to have made people worse off, it seems like actually in the north people are more in favour now. So it's possible that this is just people telling us what we want to hear. So we wanted to dig further and see how the benefits and costs of WMAs played out from our more detailed household survey. So there are two different types of benefits, one of which is kind of community level benefits, which are realised in terms of input into development projects and affect everyone fairly equally. The other one is more individual household level revenues. Looking at the community level benefits, it seems like well, there are various categories we considered, but starting off with the creation or repair of new secondary or primary schools, seemed like across all of the WMAs there had been these inputs in development projects. But it's worth stressing that this isn't directly from WMAs. In most of the cases, people felt like they had to contribute a substantial proportion to the creation of these new schools. But where WMAs did make a contribution was that in most cases, the majority of people thought that the existence of the WMA had meant that those personal contributions that households had to make towards development projects had been reduced. It's worth pointing out that the kind of one example where that isn't really true, Makame, there isn't really much WMA activity at all yet, so it's not surprising that we see that. Moving swiftly on to the kind of more individual level benefits, where the households benefit directly from income to members of the household. The first thing to say is that, looking at three of the big categories of benefits that we expect people to get from WMAs, the proportion of households which benefit is very low across the board. So the largest proportion benefit from WMA and Village Natural Resource Committee allowances, and essentially this is money that people get for sitting on the committees. And it's worth pointing out again that this tends to benefit, across all of these WMAs, on average, it tends to benefit richer people, richer households, more than poorer households. By contrast, things like patrolling, when people are employed as scouts to kind of enforce the rules of the WMA, this benefits a smaller proportion of people, although the actual amount of money that each household gets from that is substantially larger. And that tends to be skewed more towards the poorer members of the community. But it's worth saying that even that is something of a double-edged sword, because patrolling is a significantly riskier activity than sitting on a WMA committee. The last thing to point out on this slide is just that one of the big kind of driving forces behind the establishment of WMAs is the idea that people would be able to benefit from tourism revenue. When we look at the proportion of households that are actually getting benefit from tourism, it's tiny, direct, if we quantify that in terms of direct income. So the last set of results before I wrap this up, because I know I'm running up against time, is just to look at some of the costs. And for this, I wanted to pick out one particular community, or one particular WMA, which is Burundi. So there are various ways in which WMAs can impose costs, but perhaps the most obvious is in terms of the kind of indirect costs, so whether or not people lose access to resources or whether there are changes in the crop damage that result from changes in wildlife. In Burundi, if we just look at the WMA, it looks like there isn't a huge amount to say in terms of the story. Some people are better off and some are worse off. What's much more revealing is when you compare that to the distribution of changes in crop damage in the control communities, where if you see in far more of those households said that there'd been no change in crop damage. So you have this kind of excess of people in the WMA communities who feel that they are worse or much worse now, and provisionally we're attributing that to the effect of the WMA. And very briefly, it's worth saying that this pattern, this broad pattern, is repeated in terms of change in access to natural resources. So it seems like in Burundi, people are less able to get access to the construction materials, grazing land or firewood that they need to pick out three kind of prominent types of natural resources relative to controlled communities. So just to quickly wrap all of this up so I leave a little bit of time for questions, we wanted to look at the social and ecological outcomes of WMAs, and here I've really just focused on the social outcomes. So if we just ask, have WMAs helped people, we can say there's a very mixed picture. It seems like in some cases there's some evidence that they may have done, in others perhaps not. And actually, when we've looked more into the details of this, even in those cases where it looks like WMAs have helped people, there may be alternative explanations that we're starting to try and understand better. So in the case of the South, there are some additional development interventions which have gone on because of the creation of a uranium mining business, which aren't directly tied to the WMA, except perhaps in that the WMA provides an institution which can be the focus of that sort of external philanthropic investment. So counterintuitively, actually in the South, where there isn't any significant tourism revenue, it seems like people are better off, but maybe that's just down to providing that institutional structure which can attract investment. In the North, the really interesting bit perhaps is that where there is tourism revenue, it seems like people are getting worse off. And it seems like, again, this is early stage results yet, but it seems like this may be a kind of fairly typical elite capture story, whereby WMA leadership are benefiting from being able to monopolise the opportunities that are created, but a lot of the costs are quite dispersed. So I won't go into that too much, but broadly, what we're seeing is that there's a situation here whereby WMAs are they're a work in progress. The pilot phase is just coming to a finish, and there's significant plans to create more WMAs. But it seems like there's a lot of work still to do. If the potential benefits in terms of managing natural resources, creating new revenue streams are to be realised, and if they're ever going to outweigh the significant costs that WMAs can impose in terms of restricting people's access to resources. So, thank you very much for listening. Sorry if I've gone a bit over time. I'm happy to take any questions.
No, but thank you, Aidan. That was really good. If I was in charge of development here, I'd want to know what cost, benefit, risk, distribution effects there are, and you're well on the way. So, a couple of questions, points. Alison?
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm curious, you haven't mentioned if there's any interaction with trophy hunting, which is a big income earner in some areas of Tanzania. I'm not sure if it's allowed in these WMAs. And the other thing is I have done some work in the Kilimanjaro Valley, and so a very direct interaction between crop production and essentially sort of wildlife protein availability. And so could you comment on whether you've assessed the wildlife utilization in that way, whether people are benefiting at all from, essentially some might call it bushmeat, but it might be legal in these. And the third is, are these areas effective in their wildlife conservation targets or not? That wasn't mentioned. So you really looked at the social side, but are they succeeding in their wildlife targets?
Thank you.
Great, thanks. One or two others?
Thanks, my name is Bernard. I'm inquiring about the indirect benefits, for example, services from the government. For example, if you put in a WMA in a given area, there might be some development of infrastructure, which then benefits more people than what was captured. So.
Thank you. Catherine, did you?
Thank you. That was a very interesting talk. My question was really, and maybe you just haven't got to this point, whether you've got any recommendations about how to set up a WMA to make sure that it did benefit everyone.
killer question. Okay, very short.
You see, this is an impact evaluation kind of stuff. This recall issue, the household respondents, I'm curious, how are they able to recall what happened in 2006, I think? Please.
Okay, right. Briefly on all of those, Aidan, please.
Okay. So if I can remember them all, I'll try. I think I'll do them in reverse order, and then you can help me out if I've forgotten some. So in terms of recall, at the moment, we are reasonably confident that people are able to recall the period that we're talking about, because, as I said, we've got these anchor events in both the north and the south, which are very prominent, and certainly people can recall that point in time. We're in the process of checking whether or not, or checking to what extent the recall is accurate, because in some cases we do have before data where we can make a direct comparison between what people recall now and what the actual value of people's livelihoods were back then. So as I said, actually, to some extent, the answer to all these questions is going to be it's a work in progress and more will be coming out. But certainly at the moment, we're reasonably confident that we'll be able to back that up with more rigorous analysis in the future. I'm forgetting the questions now. One, I'm going to leave that one till last. Yeah. So in terms of how you could design a good WMA, Catherine may be able to say more on this, but broadly, I think one of the problems is that the way the WMAs have been set up hasn't been as in the kind of participatory, community-up spirit that many people would imagine that community-based natural resource management should be. And as a result, it's kind of tended to skew things towards favouring investors, perhaps, and the government over local communities. So I think the big kind of thing that would help a lot with WMAs, and Catherine will jump in if she disagrees, would be if those kind of agreements were shifted more to favour the communities more strongly. And in particular, one of the ways would be if we could find ways of making sure that tourism revenue was actually being returned more directly to local communities and there was more involvement, and if the same with hunting revenues, and if access to natural resources was more negotiable within kind of WMA areas rather than having areas where it's strictly excluded. Did you want to expand on that at all? Or?
Well, maybe just to give you some very rule of thumb figures. Before the WMA process came into being, a number of these villages already had deals with tourism operators and were generating significant income, and we have the figures on that. Since the WMAs have come in, the way that the Tanzanian state manages this is, first of all, to top-size 50% of all revenue. Secondly, what revenue makes it back to the WMA is then top-sized by a further 50% to account for the WMA administrative costs, which are largely targeted towards enforcement. And the 25% which is left is then distributed among the 10 or so villages, village governments, that make up the WMA. Now, when I tell you that even in the highest earning areas, which are in the north, the tourism income that comes in before any top-sizing takes place is a paltry fraction of the sum that people would normally be making, invisibly, if you like, through rearing livestock, growing crops, and carrying out their other activities. Economically, these are really problematic. I've probably gone off the point there. Back to Aidan.
Cool. So I think there was just one more question at the back, which was about whether or not we were able to look at the hunting kind of use of wild meat. Yeah, so that we will be able to look at both of those to some extent. As I didn't touch on it at all, but in terms of the conservation success, as I said, we have these kind of two other strands which are looking at land use change as far as we can tell from remote sensing data and large mammal counts that we can get from the remote surveys. As I said, that's something where the analysis is kind of still just getting up and running. So hopefully we'll be able to say more about that in the future. And ultimately, the aim is to be able to link both of these and see whether there are links or correlations between the social and ecological outcomes. In terms of wild meat use, we do have data on that. And as I said, I just kind of limited myself to a few natural resources, but we do have information on that we'll be looking into again as well.
Thanks very much, Aidan. You're on the case. The more we can make sure that ESPA puts forward poor people's needs and demands and capabilities, the better. So thanks again. Clap, clap, clap. We already have a bit of the Ryanair effect.